Before I do start this video, make sure to use my TCG player affiliate down below if you're looking for any of these singles that I talk about today. Also, this channel is sponsored by Arcane Fortress. If you're looking for the best deck boxes around, make sure to use my link down below in the description to check them out. One other way you can support the channel is by becoming a patron. There are some great benefits of being a patron to the channel, such as giveaways, deck advice, and more when you do join. Hey, what's going on YouTube? This is Devin coming back at you with another video today in Pub Stomp MTG, and in today's video, I'm going to upgrade the Eldrazi Incursion Precon deck that is coming out for Modern Horizons 3. So out of all the Precon decks, I know a lot of people are pretty excited for this. 5 color, if you want to count colorless, 6 color Eldrazi deck is pretty exciting and enticing to talk about. I would say this is probably tied as my favorite Precon out of the other ones. I do like this one, and I also like Graveyard Overdrive. I just love the aspect of reanimating big giant creatures with a Graveyard Overdrive, but Eldrazi Incursion is another great option. So in this Commander Precon, you will receive 2 commanders that you could choose as an option, one or the other. The front-facing one is Ululek Fuse Atrocity. So this one is a 5-color commander with a hybrid mana cost of colorless on each of those. It does have Devoid, and whenever you cast an Eldrazi spell, you may pay 2 colorless. If you do copy all spells you control, then copy all other activated and triggered abilities you control. You may choose new targets for those copies, and it does have a 2/5 body, which is kind of strange knowing Eldrazi and knowing that this is probably a fusion between Ulamog and Kozilek. It's weird to see them just being like a 2/5. So this is pretty powerful in the aspect that a lot of Eldrazi do have cast triggers, and you can just copy them when you pay 2 colorless mana. So I do like this one. It's incredible. Let's read the other one, and that's Azlas the Swelling Scourge. So for 3 mana, it does have whenever it or another colorless creature you control dies, you get an experience counter. You can also play a Wooburg mana. Creatures you control get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of experience counters you have, and Scions and Spawns you control gain Indestructible and Annihilator 1 until end of turn. So I like this one. This is another pretty powerful option. In a way, it doesn't feel super Eldrazi-like. I mean, there are other spawns outside of Eldrazi that you can put into this deck, but in my personal experience, I feel like looking at the 2 commanders, I personally like Ululek a little better for this deck, copying all those cast triggers. Azlask is probably better for those go wide strategies and putting a lot of spawns on the battlefield. So if I had to give a recommendation of building a deck one or the other, I would recommend Ululek, but you can build this Precon in both ways, and I feel like it'd be great in general. And just to kind of give you an overview of how I do upgrade these Precon decks is I first focus on the new cards of the deck. What kind of cards do you want to keep? I'm going to discuss about 5 or 6 of them because there's 15 total that are really good, but there's only like 5 that I mainly want to talk about that'll help push the envelope in the deck. Then later on, I will discuss the reprints. I'll probably go over about 5 key reprints that are very powerful in the deck. Of course, like what 85% of the deck is reprints, so I wanted to focus on ones that will really help your game plan. Then following that, I will focus on cards that you should add to the deck. Usually I go for a number of 10 that you should swap in and then swap out 10 cards. And so with all that said, let's get it started. Let's get upgrading. So the first card I do want to highlight is going to be a staple in many low color decks like 1 to 2 or maybe even 3 color decks, maybe not. But seriously, Eldritch Immunity is going to be a crazy card in those low color decks. This has the simple ability for 1 colorless mana. Target creature you control gains protection from each color until end of turn. So whether someone's trying to Deadly Relic your creature, or if you want to get through for some damage and you want to make sure your creature is unblockable, you can just target one of your creatures. And of course it does have that overload ability by paying 4 and a colorless, so that each creature card will have that ability. So that's the biggest reason why I feel like this is going to be an instant staple in many decks to come, because you can just target a creature that you control. It doesn't even have to be an Eldrazi creature. If you want to protect your creature, you do have this to thank for. Another spell that I'm absolutely in love with is Eldrazi Confluence. This is like one of those Mystic Confluences, Fiery Confluences kind of like spells. So this modal option does have 3 different options that you can choose more than once. You can give a creature +3/-3 until end of turn, so like a removal spell, or even a buff spell if you have a bigger creature on the battlefield. Its second ability is basically just a flicker ability, and its third ability, you just make a colorless Scion creature token that adds for a colorless mana when you sacrifice it. The versatility of this card is quite crazy. I love this option because if you want to remove 3 threats on the battlefield by choosing that first mode, you can. Of course, flickering is always good. There's a lot of ETBs that you can take advantage of. Unfortunately, with this deck, it's a lot of cast triggers, so it won't really do too good. But most likely what you're going to be doing in this deck, because you want to be playing big Eldrazi, you could just cast this before your turn starts and make 3 1/1 Scion creature tokens that you can sacrifice to ramp a little bit ahead so that you can set up that big payout for another big giant Eldrazi. Of course, you can choose any number of modes and different options as you'd like. If you want to do 2 for 1, if you want to do like a 3 for 0. This kind of sounds like a McDonald's special. I don't know. This is just a good card overall. But now I'll shift to the next card. This one I absolutely love because I love hijack effects, but that's Hideous Taskmaster. This one is excellent for 7 mana. It's a 7/2 body, so it's easily boltable on the battlefield, but it has a great cast trigger when you cast a spell for each opponent. Gain control up to 1 target creature that player controls until end of turn. Untap those creatures, they gain Trample, Haste, Annihilator 1 until end of turn. And this itself does have Trample, Haste, and Annihilator 1 as well. So I like this hijack effect. You can steal 3 creatures. Of course, they do have Trample, Haste, and Annihilator 1, which is pretty brutal. I will say the one downside to this creature though is the fact that it only has a 2 toughness. That's the one thing that I don't really like, but it's pretty good. I like the idea of hijacking and giving things Annihilator 1. But let's move on to another 7-drop in a different color combination with blue. Technically it's devoid, so it's colorless, but it's a blue creature essentially with that blue mana cost, and that's Benthic Anomaly. It's a 7/8 creature, so definitely better stats than the previous one as far as toughness goes. So this has a cast trigger for each opponent. Choose a creature that player controls, create a token that's a copy of one of those creatures, except its power is equal to the total power of those creatures, its toughness is equal to the total toughness of those creatures, and it's a colorless Eldrazi creature. So this is pretty much the Frankenstein of Eldrazi, am I right? I'm just trying to think of it a way that makes sense to me. So you can copy one of your opponent's best creatures on the battlefield, and on top of that, make it a high-powered creature depending on what other creatures you did target with this. Either way, this one is going to be an incredible card, especially when it scales late into the game. I mean, it's going to be late into the game if you're casting this because, of course, it's 7 mana. So this is one you definitely want to keep your eye out for sure on because it just has an amazing cast trigger to make a token that's just going to be a fused atrocity like your commander. And the last new card I do want to highlight is Bismuth Mindrender. So this Precon does have a lot of cards in the deck, but I only wanted to highlight 5 that I feel like personally are the best for the situations that you could come across. Of course, the other Eldrazi are quite insane too, but these ones were my personal favorite ones, and that does include this one too. This one for 4 mana does have a 4/3 body with Devoid and Menace. When it deals combat damage to a player, that player exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile a non-land card. You may cast that card by paying life equal to the spell's mana value rather than playing its mana cost. So this trigger pretty much resembles the ETB of Atali Primal Conqueror, one of my favorite commanders ever, but instead of ETBing, you do have to deal combat damage to a player, and it focuses on one player and you lose a lot of life. So I guess in a way it's not like Atali, but it is at the same time. So this one I actually like if you want to play this outside of Eldrazi. Of course, you could just copy this with Uluk's ability so you have 2 of these on the battlefield. So again, I think this is a pretty powerful card. It's like Nashi, Moonsage's Scion in a way with that attack trigger too, I guess. So now that I've mentioned my 5 favorite cards of the set, I do want to highlight some of the reprints in this deck. There's a lot of good ones, especially for the Eldrazi deck. And here's the whole entire deck list. Just looking at some of the cards, this does have some decent reprints. The one I do want to highlight is Morphon the Boundless. Of course, it doesn't have that frame specifically. These are all just cards that are just reprinted in there with whatever kind of frame they just throw in with MTG Goldfish. Morphon is a great one because instead of making our spells cost like what, 10 or 12 mana depending on what we add in here, it's just going to cost 5 Uberg mana. Other great reprints I do want to highlight are the fact that they did reprint all the Pain lands basically in this list. I actually think the Pain lands are a very good choice. If I was thinking about 5 colors and also having colorless in the mix, Brushland and very similar lands like that, maybe even like Sulphur Springs, and all those that you can name are going to be fantastic in here because they could tap for a colorless or tap for a specific mana you need by paying 1 damage for you. Forsaken Monument is another great reprint of the deck. I was worried that they weren't going to reprint this because it was already previously reprinted in the other previous Commander Masters. But this one is just overall very good for our colorless creatures. It buffs them up. We could also tap for 2 colorless mana instead of just 1. And whenever we cast a colorless spell, we gain 2 life. Of course, if you are playing Eldrazi, most likely you are going to be the arch enemy. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. Most likely it will happen, depending on the play group. I do like the creature package. Most of them are pretty new. Some of them are pretty familiar, like Eldrazi Displacer. I don't necessarily think you need it in the deck because, of course, we're focusing on cast triggers. We're not really focusing on ETB triggers. Oblivion Sower is a great card just to steal some spells and just cast stuff for free, basically. Sire Stagnation is great card draw in exiling your opponent's deck essentially whenever they put a land on the battlefield. World Breaker has a great cast trigger of exiling an artifact, enchantment, or land on the battlefield, and if it is in the graveyard, you can just pay 3 mana and then just return it to your hand by just sacrificing a land in addition to its other things. And overall, pretty good creature package. Of course, they're pretty heavy on the cost. There are other options. For example, Ugin the Ineffable is a great option for you to basically reduce the colorless spells you cast by 2. Rishkar's Expertise and Return of of the Wild Speaker are both great options, mainly because if you have a big creature on the battlefield, it just really scales with them. If you have Ululek Fuse Atrocity, only drawing 2 cards, that doesn't feel too good. But if you have something like a Ulamog's Dreadsire for 10, you're just going to be drawing 10 cards, and if we have Riskar's Expertise that we're casting, we could just cast something for free basically off of that. All it does is a great board wipe. I'm glad it is in this list. Eldrazi Monument is more for Azlask in my opinion. I mean, it's a great card in a general sense, but you want to be making sure you could keep up with the sacrifice trigger, because you don't want to just all of a sudden have nothing on the battlefield. But this does give a pretty big stat boost by giving your creatures +1/+1, flying, and indestructible. So if you have a lot of these on the battlefield, you can go swing away, and they all have indestructible and flying, so most likely not a lot of people have flying creatures on the battlefield. Awakening Zone has that great ability to just constantly make Eldrazi spawn tokens on the battlefield. And you have a 38 lands, and overall, I like this list. There's a couple things that you can change around here and there. I'm going to talk about 10 cards right now that you could probably take out, most likely. I mean, you could totally keep it in your deck. For me, I just personally find some of these cards not necessary. So the cards that I would remove are Eldrazi Displacer, mainly because our cards are cast triggers, not necessarily ETB triggers. I would possibly get rid of Ulamog's Crusher because it's just an 8-drop for 8 mana, Annihilator 2, and of course, that's pretty decent, but we could put better Eldrazi in the deck, so this one is not completely necessary. Artisan Kozilek could be pretty good. I mean, you can keep this in the deck if you want, but there are better options that you could be casting at 9 mana instead of this. I would also get rid of Ancient Steerings, Stuff for the Past, Warping Whale, honestly, because you are in 5 color, you don't necessarily need the colorless completely for this option. Dugan's Insight, I'm not a big fan of, mainly because it's at sorcery speed. I prefer other cards that are better, and it will only draw you 3 cards off of 5 mana, instead of like Riskar's Expertise or maybe even like Return of the Wild Speaker, which really scales with your Eldrazi. I prefer those compared to Ugin's Insight. Skittering Evasion is just going to be putting 5 spawn tokens on the battlefield for 7 mana. There's better things that we could be doing in the game instead of be casting this spell. Mystic Forge, 4 mana for this effect is okay. I mean, I'd prefer, like, for example, Sensei's Dividing Top with Mystic Forge. I'm not a big fan of this, so this one could possibly go to. Forsaken Monument is really only best with Azlask. If you are building around Azlask, I would recommend it for that deck, but if you are building around Ulalek, probably not. Eldrazi Monument could probably go too. Garruk's Uprising will give your creatures trample. I think that's pretty good enough, so we don't need to get rid of that. In Prison of the Moon, we could have better removal spells compared to this one. Eldrazi Conscription, I don't feel like this aura is going to be really that good in this deck. I mean, it can be very good with Ulalek if we just attach it to that and make a second token copy on another creature, so it could be there. So those are 10 cards, maybe even more. I'm not 100% sure as far as cards that I listed. Those are just some cards I feel like you can possibly take out. I don't think they're going to be necessary in the deck. But since we got rid of a couple cards, we need to fill those gaps with some good cards. There are some great options that you could enlist in your deck to make this a whole lot better. So there are a couple from the main set, like Kozilek's Command, Echoes of Eternity, and Idol of the False Gods. All of these have that Kindred Eldrazi type, so that way when you cast one of these spells, you could copy that with Ulalek's ability by paying 2 colorless mana, so these are extra good for that value. Based off of how much you do pay into X, these are all great options. You can make X0 1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature tokens, you scry X and draw a card, exile target creature with mana value X or less, or exile up to X target cards from a graveyard. So again, very versatile. It does have the option to make ramp with those Scion tokens. It does have card draw. It also will act as removal and graveyard removal. Echoes of Eternity is basically just a Panharmonicon, and also you could copy colorless spells, so this is just pretty ridiculous for that mana cost. Idol of the False Gods is pretty good because you could just generate little 0/1 Scion creature tokens on the battlefield. And whenever Eldrazi dies, you could just put +1/+1 counter on Idol of the False Gods. You can continue that, and eventually it will become an 8/8 creature with Annihilator 2. Commander Masters also had some other great cards to add into this list, like Zuladog Voidgorger and Flayer of Loyalties. Zuladog Voidgorger has that crazy ability, colorless spells you cast from your hand with mana value 7 or greater have Cascade. Of course, we could copy all those on the stack with our commander by paying 2 colorless mana. Zuladog is a great commander itself if you want to build around it, but of course it's even a better card in the 99 of this because you could have color cards as well. And I do think Flayer of Loyalties is also a very fun card. When you cast a spell, gain control up to target creature until end of turn, untap that creature until end of turn. It has pace, power, and toughness 10/10, gains trample, Annihilator 2, and haste. So this in a way is very similar to that red Eldrazi that hijacks that I talked about previously, but personally giving a creature +10/+10 kind of gives it the edge. Another card I wanted to highlight is Conduit of Ruin. This is an excellent card, especially in Eldrazi decks. When you cast this card, you essentially will tutor for something that's colorless with mana value 7 or greater and put it into your hand. And of course, the first creature spell you cast each turn will cost 2 less. So essentially, you could tutor for your best Eldrazi. If you copy the spell, you could search for 2 Eldrazi. Then instead of your first creature spell costing 2 less, it'll cost 4 less, which would be pretty insane, by the way. If you want to be extra salt-inducing to your opponents, It That Betrays will be an excellent choice for you because it has Annihilator 2. Whenever an opponent sacrifices a non-token permanent, put that card onto the battlefield under your control. So yeah, this is pretty messed up. Let's just be real. Having that ability to Annihilator 2, so if you have 2 of these on the battlefield because you copied it with Ulalek, you'll just swing in with Annihilator 4 essentially, and then basically get stuff onto your side of the battlefield. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention some of the Eldrazi titans like Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger and Kozilek the Great Distortion. I would have mentioned the other ones in this video, but they are pretty expensive. These are the cheapest versions. Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger is still pretty expensive. Kozilek, on the other hand, is pretty cheap. Both of these have pretty good cast triggers. Ulamog will exile 2 things on the battlefield, but if you have a commander, you could just double those exiles. And with Kozilek, it's a great control piece, basically discarding a card with mana value X and countering something with mana value X. If we are low on cards in our hand, we can refill them up to 7 with Kozilek, so that's a great option. But if I could give you any upgrade advice, is just adding as much ramp as you can. Of course, you are in 5 colors. You could use green to its fullest advantage by using like cards like 3 Visits, Sky Shroud Claim, and Nature's Lore, the best ramp options. Of course, you could pick what you like. Usually these are auto includes for me if I'm playing any kind of green deck that focuses on big creatures. But seriously, if you think you ramped enough, you haven't, because of course you're playing Eldrazi. They're the biggest and the baddest creatures to be in the multiverse, so of course you need the biggest ramp you can. But with that said, that's going to do it for me, guys. Thank you guys so much for coming by and watching this upgrade video for the Eldrazi Incursion Precon deck. This one I was super excited about. If anything else, I'm excited for the new cards. The new reprints are okay. They're not the greatest in the world. I mean, there's some that really synergize with your deck, but of course I'm super excited for the new cards. But I would like to hear your thoughts. What are your thoughts and opinions about this deck? Do you plan on buying it yourself? Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. With that out of the way, thank you for stopping by.